Welcome back, everyone. This video is going to continue our series on the philosophy of mind by looking at some of the reasons someone might give to support a physicalist view of the human mind. We're going to start the video by reviewing what physicalism is, and then we'll jump into the kinds of arguments someone might give to support this physicalist picture of the human mind. First, we'll look at how someone might appeal to the past success of science in an attempt to defend physicalism. Next, we'll look at how physicalism offers a compelling explanation for why we observe correlations between the brain and the mind. Lastly, we'll look at the appeal to Occam's razor. So, physicalism, remember, is a family of theories that claims that everything is fundamentally physical. But this is a family of views. That means there's a number of different kinds of physicalism. But we only discuss two in this unit. The first is the mind-brain identity theory that says, well, where does the mind fit within the physical world? This view says the mind is just a very special physical object, namely the brain. And all the mental stuff, like beliefs, desires, experiences, pains, memories, are just specific kinds of brain stuff. The second view is known as functionalism. And this view says, no, we actually shouldn't define the mind in terms of the stuff it's made out of. It doesn't matter if it's made out of brain stuff or something else. What matters is what it does. So in humans, it turns out that the brain is the stuff that does the relevant function of the mind. But there might be other physical things that are able to perform that same function and thereby give rise to a mind as well. So why should we believe that the mind is, or our mental states are purely physical? Why should I think that beliefs, experiences, pains, memories are purely physical phenomena? Well, the arguments in favor of physicalism are generally inductive arguments. They attempt to appeal to evidence that doesn't guarantee that the mind is physical, but are meant to show that it's the most likely hypothesis about how the human mind works. So what kind of evidence could the physicalists use to show that the mind is likely to be entirely physical? Various observations about the sciences are often used as support for physicalism. First, science has had extraordinary success in explaining non-mental things in purely physical terms. The second observation is that the scientific study of the brain and mind have revealed to us strong correlations between what happens in the brain and what happens in the mind. So let's look how you might take those two observations and develop them into more robust arguments in favor of physicalism. First, when we look at the history of science, it's rather amazing how successful it's been in providing purely physical explanations of things going on in the world around us. There's the science of meteorology to explain weather patterns. There's the science of astronomy to explain the orbit of the planets. There's the science of medicine and disease in terms of germ theory, for instance. There's the theory of evolution to explain the changes of organisms throughout time and how they adapt to their environments. There's the explanation within science between living and non-living systems. All of these are given purely physical explanations. And it's interesting to note that the success of physical science often happened despite many people at the times claiming that physical explanations were impossible. People used to think it'd be impossible to predict weather patterns. They used to attribute that to actions of the god as opposed to any purely physical phenomenon. But now we understand weather patterns, we understand cold fronts and warm fronts, etc. Now, we do not currently have complete explanations for how physical systems give rise to every aspect of the human mind. Why not? Well, a dualist might suggest that this is because the mind is something more than mere physical processes, and so obviously a purely physical explanation is never going to happen, and that's why we don't have one yet. But it's also possible that there might be a way to explain all aspects of the human mind in terms of physical processes, and maybe it's just that we need more time, better technology, etc., in order to discover how to give that explanation. Now, one physicalist argument is that the history of science giving these successful physical explanations of other things like the weather, living in non-living systems, the adaptability of organisms, suggests that we will also eventually be able to do the same thing with the mind. Even though it may seem impossible now, We have all this past evidence of how science has overcome these obstacles in the past that gives us good reason to think that it'll be able to overcome this obstacle in the future. So here's that argument in a more formal presentation. The past success of science gives us good reason to believe that there are fully physical explanations of all non-mental phenomenon, so all the things besides the human mind. Now note, this premise could be filled out by giving a list of examples of the sciences that give us explanations of different phenomena that we study, like meteorology, medicine, germ theory, etc. Therefore, with enough time and resources, science would probably reveal entirely physical explanations for all aspects of the human mind. So notice the first premise says that we have this past success of physical science outside of the mind, and says that's good reason to generalize that we'll have success in the case of the mind as well. Another attempt to use science to support physicalism appeals to more recent discoveries that mental activity seems to depend on brain activity. Here's a quote from an author, Zoe Drayson. She says, "Scientific developments have also been made in the study of pain, a paradigm of conscious experience. We now understand the role of neurotransmitters, the chemicals that relay messages across the brain synapses, in the pain of migraine headaches. During a migraine, levels of the neurotransmitter serotonin drop significantly, which causes blood vessels to dilate, resulting in extreme pain. With this knowledge of how the pain is produced, doctors can intervene to change it. Migraine sufferers can be treated with drugs that optimize serotonin levels in the brain." So what she's noting is that by studying the brain, we've noticed that there are correlations between what happens in the brain and what happens in the mind. So here's a picture of a brain. That is, when we look at that brain and all of a sudden we see some neural activity, some neurons firing in that brain, we also see that that person reports feeling pain in their conscious mind. And if we take away that neural activity, we also take away the pain. So this gives rise to the correlation or dependency argument. It says that human mental activity is strongly correlated and dependent on physical activity, namely neural activity in our brains. Physicalism is the best explanation for this correlation or dependence. That is, why would changing things in the brain change things happening in the mind? Well, one explanation is that the mind is purely physical. Therefore, physicalism is probably true since it's the best explanation for why we see this dependence. Now, both of these arguments for physicalism, they're closely related to an epistemic principle that's often used to choose between competing theories within the sciences. It's a principle known as Occam's razor. And this just says, do not multiply entities beyond necessity. Essentially, other things being equal, a simpler explanation or hypothesis is more likely to be true. So if you can explain just as much with less, that's to be preferred. Now, there's two ways in which physicalism seems to be a simpler theory than dualism. Physicalism and dualism are both committed to the existence of physical things. Both the physicalist and the dualist believes that atoms, neurons, and brains exist. But the dualist says, well, there's also this other stuff. There's non-physical, immaterial things. Physicalism and dualism are also both committed to the existence of physical laws that govern the interactions between physical things. Both the physicalists and dualists believe in the law of thermodynamics, the law of gravity. But the dualist needs to say that those aren't the only laws that exist. They also need to believe in additional laws that are very different than anything else we've seen in science that governs the way that physical and non-physical things interact with one another. And so it makes a more complicated picture by positing extra stuff that the physicalist doesn't need. And so the idea is, well, if physicalism and dualism are both equally good at explaining the mind and our behavior, then we ought to prefer the simpler theory that only posits the physical stuff rather than the physical stuff plus extra stuff like dualism. So that's all for this video. I'll see you all in the next one. Bye-bye.